On a frigid morning in ancient China, as the first light of dawn crept across the frozen plains, two vast armies faced each other in what would become the most consequential battle in human history. The date was January 20th, 1046 BC, and the fate of an entire civilization hung in the balance. On one side stood the mighty Shang Dynasty, rulers of the known world for over 6 centuries, their bronze weapons gleaming like stars against the pale sky. On the other side, a rebel force led by a young king who claimed the gods themselves had commanded him to overthrow the most powerful empire on earth. This was not merely a clash of armies. This was the moment when heaven and earth collided, when ancient bloodlines would be shattered forever, and when a single day would reshape the destiny of a quarter of the world's population. What unfolded at the Battle of Muye would echo through 3,000 years of history, establishing principles of governance that still influence nations today. The very concept of legitimate rule, the idea that power must be earned through virtue rather than birth, would be born in the blood and mud of this frozen battlefield. But how did it come to this? How did a vassal king with a fraction of his enemy's forces dare to challenge the most powerful dynasty the world had ever known? The answer lies in a story of corruption, betrayal, and divine mandate that reads like an ancient thriller. Every detail of this battle has been scrutinized by historians for millennia, and only recently have scientists been able to pinpoint the exact date using astronomical calculations that would have been impossible just decades ago. The year 1046 BC marked the end of an era that had dominated China since before the pyramids were built. The Shang Dynasty had ruled with an iron fist for over 600 years, their kings claiming divine authority through bloodline and their power enforced by the most advanced military technology of the age. Bronze weapons, horse-drawn chariots, and massive armies had made them seemingly invincible. Their capital at Yin was a marvel of the ancient world, filled with palaces that dazzled visitors and workshops that produced artifacts so beautiful they were considered gifts worthy of the gods. Yet beneath this glittering surface, the Shang Empire was rotting from within. King Dixin, known to history as King Zhou of Shang, had become the embodiment of everything wrong with absolute power. Ancient records describe a ruler so consumed by luxury and cruelty that his own people whispered prayers for his downfall. He built pools filled with wine where his courtiers would swim, while musicians played from floating platforms. He constructed towers of meat so high they scraped the clouds, all while his people starved in the streets below. But it was not merely excess that marked Dixin's reign. It was cruelty beyond imagination. He invented new forms of torture for his entertainment, forcing prisoners to walk across red-hot metal beams while he laughed at their screams. His consort, Daji, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her sadism, encouraged these atrocities and devised even more horrific punishments for those who displeased her. Together, they transformed the Shang court into a nightmare that shocked even the hardened nobles of the age. Far to the west, in the Wei River Valley, another power was quietly growing. The Zhou people had served as vassals to the Shang for generations, guarding the western frontier against barbarian raids while paying tribute to their overlords. Their leader, King Wu of Zhou, was everything that Dixin was not. Where the Shang king was cruel, Wen was just. Where Dixin was wasteful, Wen was prudent. Where the Shang court reveled in excess, the Zhou practiced restraint and virtue. King Wen's reputation for wisdom and fairness spread throughout the land like wildfire. Refugees from Shang oppression fled westward to his protection. Smaller kingdoms began to look to the Zhou for leadership rather than to their traditional Shang overlords. Even within the Shang heartland, whispers began perhaps to circulate that the mandate of heaven, the divine right to rule, had passed from the corrupt dynasty to their virtuous vassals. Dixin was not blind to this growing threat. As reports reached him of his vassals' increasing popularity, paranoia consumed him. In a moment that would prove fatal to his dynasty, he made the decision to arrest King Wen and drag him in chains to the Shang capital. For months, the Zhou leader languished in a Shang prison, while Dixin debated whether to execute him outright or devise some more elaborate punishment. The imprisonment of King Wen sent shockwaves throughout the land. Here was a man universally respected for his virtue, a leader who had never raised his hand against his overlord, now suffering in chains for the crime of being too beloved by his people. The Zhou nobles, led by Wen's brilliant strategist Jiang Ziya, worked frantically to secure their leader's release. They gathered tribute beyond imagination, rare treasures and beautiful women, anything that might appeal to Dixin's notorious appetites. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, King Wen was released. But the damage had been done. The arrest had been a public humiliation that could not be forgotten or forgiven. More importantly, it had revealed the true nature of Shang rule to anyone who still harbored illusions about their overlord's justice. As Wen returned to his Western kingdom, he carried with him not just the memory of his chains, but the certain knowledge that war was now inevitable. King Wen spent his remaining years preparing for the confrontation he knew must come. He strengthened alliances with neighboring kingdoms, many of whom had their own grievances against Shang rule. He modernized his military, adopting the latest techniques in bronze working and chariot warfare. Most importantly, he began the careful work of undermining Shang authority by demonstrating what just governance could look like. But fate had other plans. In 1050 BC, just as his preparations were reaching completion, King Wen died suddenly, leaving his son Wu to inherit not just a kingdom, but a sacred mission. The younger king found himself in an impossible position. His father had prepared the way for rebellion, but the actual decision to take up arms against the most powerful empire on earth now fell to him. King Wu was not his father. Where Wen had been patient and diplomatic, Wu was bold and decisive. Where his father had been content to build slowly and carefully, Wu burned with the urgency of youth and the fire of righteous anger. He had watched his father suffer in Shang chains, had seen the tears his mother shed during those dark months, and had witnessed firsthand the corruption that was devouring the kingdom from within. Yet even Wu hesitated. To rebel against one's overlord was not just treason, it was a violation of the most sacred bonds that held society together. The Shang had ruled for 6 centuries. Their kings traced their lineage back to the gods themselves. Who was he? A mere vassal, to challenge such ancient authority? The answer came from an unexpected source. Jiang Ziya, his father's trusted advisor, brought Wu a message that would change everything. The old strategist had been studying the heavens, watching the movement of stars and planets that the ancients believed reflected the will of the gods. What he had observed filled him with both awe and terror. The celestial signs were unmistakable. The mandate of heaven itself was shifting. The cosmic forces that had supported Shang rule for centuries were withdrawing their protection, seeking a new dynasty of their blessing worthy. But the signs also carried a warning. The window of opportunity was narrow, and if Wu did not act soon, the moment would pass, and the chance might not come again for generations. As 1047 BC turned to 1046, the young Zhou king made his decision. He would gather his allies, march east toward the Shang heartland, and stake everything on a single throw of the dice. The battle that would reshape the world was about to begin. The preparation for what would become the Battle of Muye began in earnest, as King Wu sent messengers galloping across the frozen landscape to every corner of his realm and beyond. The call went out to tribal chieftains, minor kings, and anyone who had suffered under Shang oppression. This was not merely a summons to war, but an invitation to witness the birth of a new age. The response was overwhelming. From the mountains came fierce warriors who had never bowed to Shang authority. From the southern rivers arrived boat people who had been forced to pay crushing tributes. From the eastern plains rode cavalry commanders whose families had been destroyed by Shang cruelty. By the winter of 1046 BC, an army unlike any the world had seen was gathering in the Zhou homeland. These were not professional soldiers bound by pay or fear, but men united by a common cause. They came carrying their own weapons, leading their own horses, bringing their own supplies. Rich and poor stood shoulder to shoulder, bound together by the shared conviction that the time had come to overthrow a dynasty that had lost its way. The army that assembled under King Wu's banner numbered roughly 50,000 men, but their true strength lay not in numbers, in their unshakable belief in their cause. These warriors had seen their villages burned, their families enslaved, their children taken as tribute. They had watched corrupt Shang officials grow fat while honest farmers starved. They had witnessed the spectacle of a king who treated human lives as toys for his amusement. As winter deepened, King Wu made a decision that stunned even his closest advisors. Rather than wait for spring when travel would be easier, he would march immediately. The harsh winter conditions that would normally make military campaigns impossible would serve as his allies. The Shang would never expect an attack in the depths of winter, and their scattered armies would be unable to concentrate quickly enough to mount an effective defense. The march east began on a bitter morning when the breath of men and horses formed clouds that hung in the still air like the ghosts of ancient warriors. The Zhou army moved in disciplined columns across terrain that would have challenged even experienced troops. Rivers had frozen solid, creating natural bridges that allowed rapid movement. Snow covered the landscape in a white shroud that muffled sound and concealed their approach from Shang scouts. King Wu himself rode at the head of the column, his breath visible in the frigid air as he urged his men forward through the endless white expanse. Behind him stretched a river of bronze and leather, spear points catching the weak winter sun like stars fallen to earth. The sight was both beautiful and terrible, a reminder that they were not just marching toward battle but toward destiny itself. Word of the Zhou advance reached the Shang capital with shocking speed. Messengers arrived at the palace gasping for breath, their faces white with cold and terror. The impossible had happened. The vassal king had dared to raise his hand against his overlord, and he was coming with an army that grew larger with each passing day as more rebels joined his cause. King Di received this news while lounging in his heated palace, surrounded by the luxury that had become his obsession. His first reaction was not fear but outrage. How dare this upstart challenge the divine authority of the Shang? Did he not understand that the gods themselves had blessed this dynasty for 6 centuries? The very idea of rebellion seemed so absurd that Di initially dismissed it as the ravings of frightened messengers. But as more reports poured in, each confirming the reality of the Zhou advance, even Di could no longer ignore the threat. His eastern armies were scattered across distant campaigns, conquering new lands to feed his appetite for tribute and slaves. The troops immediately available to defend the capital numbered in the hundreds of thousands, but they were spread across a vast territory and would need time to concentrate. In desperation, Di made a decision that would seal too quickly his fate. Unable to recall his regular armies, he ordered weapons distributed to the vast population of slaves and prisoners who worked in the capital region. These were men who had been torn from their homes, forced to labor in mines and workshops, treated worse than animals by their Shang masters. Now they were being handed bronze spears and told to die defending the very system that had destroyed their lives. The irony was lost on Di but it was not lost on his intended soldiers. As weapons were distributed to men who had every reason to hate their overlords, whispers began to spread through the slave quarters. The Zhou were coming, the righteous king who treated his people with justice. Perhaps the gods really had withdrawn their mandate from the corrupt dynasty. Perhaps this was their chance not just for freedom, but for revenge. Meanwhile, the Zhou army continued its relentless advance across the winter landscape. They moved with the precision of a great machine, each unit knowing its place, each in the grand design. King Man understanding his role, Wu had learned well from his father's preparations. This was not a rabble seeking plunder, but a disciplined force, united by shared purpose and unshakable conviction. As they drew closer to the Shang heartland, the Zhou encountered the first signs of the empire's internal collapse. Villages stood empty, their populations fled or dead. Granaries had been looted bare to feed the armies or fill the royal storehouses. Fields lay fallow, their crops unharvested because the farmers had been conscripted or enslaved. This was not the prosperous kingdom the Shang claimed to rule, but a wasteland created by their own excess. The psychological impact on the Zhou warriors was profound. They had come expecting to face a mighty empire, but instead they found evidence of decay and collapse at every turn. Their confidence grew with each mile they marched, their convictions strengthened by the visible proof of Shang misrule. They were not rebels challenging legitimate authority, but liberators come to free a suffering land. On the evening of January 19th, 1046 BC, the Zhou army made camp within sight of their destination. Before them lay the plain of Muye, a vast expanse of frozen ground that would serve as the stage for the most important battle in human history. Across that plain, barely visible in the winter twilight, the fires of the Shang army twinkled like fallen stars. King Wu stood at the edge of his camp, staring across the battlefield where tomorrow would decide the fate of civilization itself. The weight of destiny pressed down upon his shoulders like a physical force. Everything his father had worked for, everything his people had suffered, everything they hoped to achieve, would be decided in the coming dawn. Behind him, his warriors made their final preparations, sharpening weapons that would either liberate a nation or doom a dynasty to extinction. The night before the battle was unlike any other in the history of warfare. As darkness fell over the plain of Muye, both armies settled into an uneasy vigilance. The Zhou warriors huddled around their fires, sharing stories of home and reasons for fighting. These men had marched through the bitter winter not for gold or glory, but for the chance to see their children grow up free from Shang tyranny. Their quiet conversations carried the weight of men who knew they might not see another sunset, yet faced that possibility with steady resolve. Across the frozen expanse, the Shang camp told a different story. The professional soldiers, veterans of countless campaigns, prepared their equipment with mechanical precision, but mingled among them were the reluctant conscripts and armed slaves, men who had been handed weapons and ordered to die for a cause they despised. The tension in their ranks was palpable, like a bowstring stretched to its breaking point. King Wu spent the hours before dawn in prayer and contemplation. Ancient texts tell us he consulted the oracle bones, seeking final confirmation that heaven truly supported his cause. The signs were unmistakable. The planets had aligned in configurations not seen for generations. The winter itself seemed to bend to his will, and everywhere he looked, omens pointed toward victory. Yet the magnitude of what he was attempting still filled him with awe. Tomorrow, he would either emerge as the founder of a new dynasty or perish as a failed rebel. As the first pale light of January 20th began to creep across the horizon, both armies stirred into motion. The sound of bronze against leather, the stamping of horses, and the murmur of final prayers created a symphony of preparation that echoed across the plain. King Wu emerged from his tent clad in armor that gleamed like captured starlight, his ceremonial battle axe gripped in his left hand and a white banner unfurled in his right. What happened one of the most famous next would become speeches in Chinese history. Standing before his assembled army, King Wu delivered words that would echo through 3 millennia of Chinese culture. His voice carried across the ranks as he spoke of justice, of divine mandate, and of the sacred duty they had undertaken. He invoked the image of a hen crowing at dawn, warning that when the natural order is corrupted, disaster follows. The Shang had allowed feminine influence to poison their governance, he declared, turning strong leadership into weakness and wisdom into folly. The speech was masterfully crafted, weaving together practical concerns and cosmic significance. Wu did not merely promise victory, he promised righteousness. He told his warriors they fought not as rebels but as instruments of heaven's will, chosen to restore proper order to a world thrown into chaos by Shang corruption. The effect on his army was electric. Men who had marched through winter's worst now stood straighter, gripped their weapons tighter, and gazed across the battlefield with the confidence of those who fight for something greater than themselves. As the sun climbed higher, revealing the full scope of the opposing forces, the disparity in numbers became starkly apparent. The Shang army stretched across the plain like a dark tide, their bronze armor and weapons creating a glittering sea of metal that seemed to extend beyond the horizon. Conservative estimates placed their strength at over 500,000 men, a force so vast it defied comprehension. Against this multitude, King Wu's 50,000 warriors appeared almost insignificant, a small island of defiance in an ocean of enemy steel. Yet numbers alone do not determine the outcome of battles, especially when those numbers include men who have no desire to fight. The Shang had made a fatal error in arming their slaves and prisoners, assuming that weapons in their hands would translate to loyalty in their hearts. But loyalty cannot be purchased with bronze spears, and the moment of truth was rapidly approaching when these reluctant soldiers would have to choose between dying for their oppressors or living for their liberators. The morning air grew thick with tension as both armies completed their final preparations. Drums began to beat, a rhythmic pounding that seemed to match the heartbeat of the earth itself. Banners snapped in the wind, bright colors against the pale winter sky. Horses snorted and pawed the frozen ground, sensing the coming violence. The very air seemed to crackle with the electricity of approaching destiny. King Wu raised his ceremonial axe toward the heavens, and the Zhou army began its advance. They moved not in a desperate charge, but in disciplined formation, their shields locked together and their spears bristling like the quills of some enormous beast. The sound of 50,000 men marching in unison created a thunderous rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. This was not merely an attack, it was a statement, a declaration that heaven's will would not be denied. The Shang response was immediate, but chaotic. Orders rang out across their vast formation as commanders struggled to coordinate a defense against an enemy they had never expected to face. The professional soldiers at the center of their line held firm, their bronze armor gleaming and their weapons ready. But on the flanks, where the armed slaves and conscripts were positioned, a different drama was unfolding. As the Zhou advance drew closer, something unprecedented began to happen within the Shang ranks. It started as whispered conversations, men looking sideways at their neighbors and asking themselves why they should die to protect a system that had given them nothing but suffering. The armed slaves, many of whom had lost families to Shang cruelty, began to remember that their enemies were not the disciplined warriors approaching across the plain, but the masters who had put chains on their wrists and whips across their backs. The moment of contact between the two armies created a sound unlike anything heard before in human warfare. The clash of bronze against bronze, the splintering of wooden shields, and the cries of men locked in mortal combat combined to create a symphony of violence that echoed across the frozen plain. But as the battle was joined, the true drama was unfolding not in the clash of weapons, but in the hearts and minds of the Shang soldiers. The defection began slowly, almost imperceptibly. A few armed slaves at the edge of the formation simply laid down their weapons and walked away. Then others followed, first in ones and twos, then in groups, and finally in massive waves. The sight of their supposed defenders abandoning the field had a devastating effect on Shang morale. Professional soldiers who had never known defeat suddenly found themselves fighting not just against the enemy in front of them, but against the collapse of their own ranks. King Wu, fighting in the thick of the melee, witnessed something that would become the stuff of legend. Entire sections of the Shang army were not just retreating but actively changing sides, turning their weapons against their former officers and joining the Zhou advance. What between had begun as a battle two armies was transforming into something far more profound, popular, an uprising that swept across the battlefield like wildfire. The psychological impact of this mass defection cannot be overstated. The Shang had built their power on the assumption that superior numbers and equipment would always triumph over inferior forces, but the Battle of Muye demonstrated that when men fight, when they believe for justice rather than fear their cause is righteous, rather than merely profitable, they become capable of achieving the impossible. As the morning wore on, the inevitable became apparent. The Shang army, despite its overwhelming numerical superiority, was collapsing from within. Professional soldiers found themselves isolated and surrounded, cut off from support as their allies melted away or joined the enemy. The careful formations that had served the dynasty for centuries dissolved into chaos as panic spread through the ranks like plague. King Dixin, watching the disaster unfold from his command position, finally understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. This was not merely a military defeat, but a repudiation of everything his dynasty represented. The mandate of heaven, which had sustained Shang rule for 6 centuries, had indeed passed to their enemies. The cosmic order itself had shifted, and no amount of bronze or blood could restore what heaven had withdrawn. The rout was complete by midday, the Shang Empire shattered beyond repair. As smoke rose from the burning royal palace, where Dixin had chosen death over dishonor, the Zhou warriors stood amid a battlefield transformed by more than victory. They had witnessed the birth of a new world order, one where virtue would triumph over bloodline, where justice would matter more than tradition. King Wu's triumph at Muye established the mandate of heaven, a revolutionary concept that would shape Chinese governance for 3,000 years. The idea that rulers must earn their authority through moral conduct rather than inherit it through birth became the foundation of Chinese political thought. This single day, when the sun seemed to stand still over a frozen battlefield, changed the course of human civilization itself, proving that even the mightiest empires must answer to heaven's justice.